morning, everyone. Welcome to the final breakfast talk of the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center for the 2021-2022 academic year. My name is Richard Hanley. I'm the director of the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. And for today's purposes, it's important to know I'm also a handball player. I should mention, however, that I am not of the caliber of player as those you will be hearing from very shortly, but I am pleased to be in their presence, as I've been pleased to watch their playing over the years. And we will have 4 speakers today talking about various aspects of handball. As a what we call street player, or I just play on weekends recreationally, been doing it for decades, but there's a world of handball that exists, and that's the world we're going to get to see inside of today. We'll have veterans who worked for years on various aspects of making that world visible to people, and we'll also hear from someone who has created an organization to make that world accessible to people to whom it was not accessible in the past before that organization came to be. So I want to start this morning with introducing Dan Flickstein, who is a noted handball player. He had been a champion. He will tell you about his life as a handball player. He was also have a connection in terms of we both were high school English teachers for a good portion of our careers. And you will hear that Dan and Jai, who we will hear from later, were high school players, as was Paul. Dory, I don't think she was. But I want to start with introducing Dan Flickstein, who's going to, he's also a kind of historian of the game. And so he's going to give us an overview of the game of one-wall handball. And I should say the connection, why someone might ask, is the BWRC having a breakfast talk on one-wall handball. And the reason for that is simply that the mecca, the locus, the place of one-wall handball are the courts on Coney Island. If you've never seen the courts or viewed games there, I suggest sometime when you're taking your children or whomever to the aquarium, just walk a few steps on the other side of the boardwalk and you will see some fantastic handball games. If you go at certain times, you will also see the national championships, because that's where the national championships are played. And thus, that is our reason for being able to offer this breakfast talk on handball. And so without further ado, I will introduce you to Dan Flickstein.
Thank you, Richard. I was wondering what the appropriate attire would be for me this morning. And so I'm going to stand for a moment and show you what I selected. Okay, not only that, but this too. Okay, now in 2017, I published a book called The Perfect Game, New York Handball Stories, which is a compilation of the many articles that I wrote for the United States Handball Association organ, Handball. I'm going to read most of the preface to you, which will give a good flavor of what handball is, what it meant to me. And then I have a slideshow which will go through some of the historical figures of handball, and I'll talk briefly about each slide. And if you don't get an idea of the long and colorful history of handball, nothing else will do it for you. So, addiction takes many forms. Most familiar addictions are those associated with drugs, alcohol, smoking, and gambling. But at 30 years of age, I was addicted to handball. I played 7 days a week. In summer, each of those 7 days incorporated 4 to 5 hours of competing. One might conclude that there was nothing wrong in that. In fact, it can be viewed as a healthy pastime, except that it wasn't. I had a wife and 2 small children during those years. In 1974, the year I turned 30, I was drug education specialist at Brooklyn's Abraham Lincoln High School. I attended monthly sessions with similarly titled colleagues of my district. The purpose of such gatherings was for the counselors to unburden themselves in therapeutic style. Among issues other counselors presented, I offered up for consideration the impending dissolution of my marriage, which was surely imminent. Heavy matters concluded, we were able to chat more casually. On my mentioning that I was a handball player, Tilden's high school counselor informed me that he was also the school's handball coach and that he had mentored 2 years prior to the year of our meeting, the best young player in the city, Marcel Goldfarb, who was now among the best tournament players in the country. On hearing that, I told my fellow counselor that I was slated to play Marcel in my next match in the current AAU National Handball Tournament. "Well, that's the end of you," he said bluntly, with great assurance. I don't think so," I humbly replied. "In fact, I'm probably favored to win." I'm sure he must have thought that at the least I had an overinflated opinion of myself, or at the worst, I was totally delusional. But our next group get-together a month later, before we began serious sharing, he asked how I did against the kid. When I told him I killed him, he responded, half in shock. "What? You beat that kid? No wonder you're divorced." Now, the implication was clear. One doesn't become extremely proficient at anything without abundant practice. He was right about me. My addiction to handball made me a top player, but it also, by and large, cost me my first marriage. I'm confident, not that it's any consolation, that I'm not alone in having sacrificed major components of my personal life to handball. It can create addicts out of its competitors and spectators. New York City handball is a game played by lots of kids. Some begin when they are 8 or 9 years old, even younger. Others discover handball in their early teens. It doesn't cost much to play. All that's needed is a ball. If a city-constructed regulation court is unavailable, a simple wall on the side of a building works, especially when nobody opens a window and threatens to call the cops. Artificial lines can be chalk drawn with a rock and some crude rules followed, oftentimes in a crude manner. Because the only essential expense is the purchase of a ball, the game is therefore attractive to poor folks. And in part because of this, handball has too often become associated with street toughs who before, during, and after playing drink alcohol and smoke marijuana. But that's not close to the total picture of the game of New York City handball, not by a long shot, no pun intended. It is also a sport which many people play on weekends all around the city on the more than 5,000 regulation courts whose construction proliferated during the 1930s. And the players are not only the street kids and weekend athletes. There are some who become noticeably better at the game than others. Some become proficient beyond imagination, but there hasn't been a way to profit from such advanced skill. Interest in the game has never been generated to a level whereby spectators would pay to see the best vie against one another to determine who the champion would be. The most which has occurred for players who excel at handball is that associations like the Amateur Athletic Union and the United States Handball Association, have and will organize tournaments in which boys and girls and men and women compete to establish the champions. That type of competition has existed in New York and has been on official records since 1924, when the AAU first sanctioned the National One Wall Tournament. AAU records survive until this very day, although the AAU stopped its one wall handball participation in 1976 when the USHA took complete control of the sport. The records are available for scrutiny on the United States Handball Association website. The people who enter official handball tournaments are not only from economically deprived neighborhoods, they come from all walks of life. They are a wonderfully diverse group. Some are computer consultants, some are lawyers, some doctors, some teachers, others from New York's finest and New York's bravest. Some are salespeople, some are truck drivers, some are indeed financially less able. Others, however, are affluent. But once a man or a woman plays in a tournament, all that really matters is that he or she knows how to score 21 points 2 times before the opponent does in order to win a match and advance to play another opponent. And essentially, people play for one reason: bragging rights, recognition, totaling in a small world prestige. Now, I'm going to interrupt myself for a moment because I am aware that in the last maybe 5 or 10 years that some cash prizes have been awarded to the winners of one wall tournaments. There is history behind New York City handball. According to the late Mickey Bleckman, a handball pundit and New York State United States Handball Association award winner, single wall handball began at New York beaches, where people used a balled tennis ball and with open hands struck it against the sides of jetties at low tide. Spurred by one Charles O'Connell, beach clubs around the city began constructing one-wall handball courts for their patrons. In the early part of the 20th century, Brighton Beach Baths in South Brooklyn boasted more than 20 such courts, which were in constant use. By the 1920s, the AAU began sponsoring state and metropolitan one-wall handball tournaments. Eventually, before the turn of the decade, the AAU, as previously mentioned, sanctioned the National One Wall Tournament in metropolitan New York. During the 1930s, the New York City Parks Department, under the auspices of Robert Moses, constructed literally thousands of one-wall courts around the 5 boroughs. Indoor facilities were also constructed, and competition intensified, with women's events being held as well as men's. During the 1940s, games and tournaments diminished because of the serious threats of World War II. By the late 50s, however, the sport regenerated. In 1959, led by Brooklyn's Irving Ehrlich, the United States Handball Association, based in Chicago and presided over by Robert W. Kendler, began competing with the AAU for control of one-wall tournaments. For 17 years, there were 2 major national tournaments for one-wall enthusiasts and its best players. In 1976, the AAU held its last sanctioned one-wall tournament, which was played in Coney Island at West 5th Street and Surf Avenue. Aforementioned O'Connell wrote the rules for the sport, which for the most part have gone virtually unchanged. Now, I began playing handball at the age of 13 in the Sunset Park area of Brooklyn, specifically at Charles O. Dewey Junior High School. It was the sport in which nearly all the athletic boys, and somewhat athletic boys as well, competed. I entered my first sanctioned tournament, the Daily Mirror Parks Department event in 1960. I was 16. 2 years later, encouraged by Irving Ehrlich, I entered the National USHA Junior Singles Tournament. As years passed, I became increasingly fascinated, not only playing the game, but with observing it as well. In 1969, my first handball article was published in USHA's magazine called Ace, eventually to be renamed Handball Magazine. By 2009, with nearly 150 articles published in Ace and Handball, I was given a rare prestigious acknowledgement by the USHA, the Carl Porter Award, named for the second president of the organization, who saved the USA from bankruptcy in the late 70s. By the way, if it sounds as though I'm being immodest, it's because I am being immodest. Since 2009, I have continued to be inspired by the game of handball. At 71 years of age, at this writing, I still play, even after enduring much needed total bilateral knee replacement. And I have continued to write articles of three types: tournament results, personalities, and special features. In the beginning, I wrote just for fun. As the years passed, I made a conscious effort to keep the tone and subject matter of my written work about handball out of the gutter, quote unquote. It has been my personal goal to elevate handball to a game played indeed by tough athletes, but by tough athletes who are gentlemen and gentlewomen as well. In 2013, a group of 7 lifetime players and contributors to the sport of one-wall handball, myself among them, formed an official committee and worked for 2 years to create a virtual New York Handball Hall of Fame, which went live in July of 2015. In the pages to follow, I have omitted tournament results in deference to special features and personality, which I feel are of greater interest to those who admire the game of handball because they played it, and like me, got to marvel at some of the fabulous athletes who played the game better than anyone else. Not only did I get to observe the one-wall greats of my generation, I actually did battle with them on a competitive basis, sometimes actually defeating a Class A player. It is my hope in the pages to follow that we will enable people to see one-wall handball as more than just a street game played by neighborhood tough guys, but that it has potential to become a brilliant sport, judging by some of its great players, one whose destiny is ultimately the International Olympic Games. All right, there's a bit more, but I'll leave that. Now, before I go to my slideshow, there is one picture in my book that isn't in that show that I absolutely need to show. Here it is. Let's see. Can you see it? Okay. The picture is of Vic Hershkowitz. Vic Hershkowitz has been all through my years of playing, and I'm sure even today, Mr. Handball. He was the greatest one-wall player of his time. He branched out to play 3-wall handball, and he branched out to play 4-wall handball. And he was a great champion, not just an ordinary champion. A champion is a champion, of course, but a great champion in all 3 aspects of handball, which certainly earned him the title of Mr. Handball. Okay, at this point, I'd like to go to my slideshow, and hopefully I'll know how to do this. Okay, there we are.
Slideshow. Hit it again.
Okay. Okay, this is now visible. What? Hang on a moment.
Hold on.
You're almost there, Dan. You just
I know,
probably just click on the left. Yeah, click on that, and you've clicked on slideshow already.
You could
Play
press
from the beginning.
F5. You could press F5 and that does it. F5. No, go back. F5.
You messed up.
Oh, whatever.
Something happened.
Oh boy.
You opened the wrong one. Another one.
I did?
Yeah, it seemed like this is blank. Yeah, open it again, and then once it's up, just press F5, and that would automatically
No, it disappeared. That's what happened. Sorry. Let me get to it. It was working perfectly yesterday.
It worked perfectly earlier.
I know.
Here it is. Okay, you've got it.
You got it?
You could see it? Okay, let me just get it. Okay, got it.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, you did it fine. Thanks.
Okay. Now, I chose the title page for a specific reason. The venue is Coney Island, where championships have been played now since, I believe, 1984. Before that, they were played in different venues, and I'll go into that in a moment. The man raising his arms is Joel Davidson, and he's the reason that I selected this particular photo as the title page. Joel was the youngest national singles champion ever. This was an AAU sanctioned tournament. Joel was 17 at the time. He beat 5 of the best players, including the man in back of him, Mark Levine, who was a Hall of Fame player. Okay, so let me move on. Oh, one more thing about Joel. He didn't continue with handball. He came back the next year without having played very much, and he made the quarterfinals. But after that, he moved to another part of the country, and he never returned. Quite sure he would have been one of the best players ever. This is in the 1950s. The venue is Brighton Beach Baths. If you will look in the background, you will see not only the buildings behind it, but the crowd. There was a stadium built in Brighton Beach Baths named after Joe Garber. It was Garber Stadium. Joe Garber was a great player of the 1940s who was unfortunately killed in World War II. The player in the front swinging is Harry Goldstein. Now, although this shot was taken in the 50s, Harry Goldstein was a great champion of the 1930s, having won 4 national tournaments, 2 doubles and 2 singles. And the gentleman who gave me this photograph, Charlie Danilczyk, who was the player on the left, his opinion was that Harry Goldstein was even a greater player than Vic Hershkowitz was in one-wall handball. These 2 gentlemen were the finalists in 1955's AAU championship. The fellow on the left is Marty the Farmer Cushman. Now, Marty was a classic one-wall handball player who volleyed you from side to side. A wonderful player, an institution in Coney Island. He played 2 or 3 evenings a week, and when he played, the ice cream man used to stay later because the crowds would stay just to watch the farmer play handball. Why was he called the farmer? There were several answers to that. The first one I had heard was that because he dives on the floor and digs out the shots, but I don't know if that's true. But the farmer played singles only and well into his 70s, continuing to beat young upcoming players. Now, the fellow on the right who won the tournament that year is Oscar Robert. Oscar was one of 3 great handball playing brothers. And like Vic Hershkowitz, all 3 of them ventured into 3-wall and 4-wall as well and were champions in all 3. Oscar was probably the best out of the 3 players, an extremely aggressive, hard-hitting player. I used to love to watch him play. Sheila Marashek was the first notable woman handball champion. And in 2015, so many years later, we were able to get her into the United States Handball Association Hall of Fame. Sadly, last year she passed away from COVID. Now here is 1966. The 2 gentlemen in the middle are the ones I'll focus on, but the gentleman all the way to the left is Irving Ehrlich. Irving was that man who was instrumental in getting the USHA to begin to sponsor handball, one-wall handball in New York City. And the gentleman all the way to the right is Morris Levitsky, and I'll talk about him in a moment. Morris was the single greatest handball referee. Now, the gentleman on the right holding the trophy is Ken Gamble. He was a wonderful handball player, always toted a big belly. He came in second that year and surprisingly gave Steve Sandler, the champion, a real run for his money. He scored 18 points in the 3rd game. Steve Sandler was on his way to winning a record 15 national one-wall singles championships. This is Morris Levitsky. I met Levitsky around 1961 or 62. He used to volunteer to referee games in the park. Eventually, he started to referee games and sanction tournaments, and he became so adept at it, and he became so knowledgeable with the players that he used to seed the tournaments. In 1976, he became the Metropolitan AAU one-wall handball commissioner. One time I said about Levitsky, he's the only person I know who wrote handball referee on his tax return. Now, in 1966, Jim Jacobs, the fellow swinging, who was a great, great four-wall champion, traveled all the way to Avenue P in Brooklyn, where money games were played. He came to challenge the one-wall champion, Steve Sandler, who's the fellow in the back. Before the game, Jacobs made a speech about how he had never really played one-wall handball before, and it's a totally different game. So the crowd shouldn't expect all that much from him. In the meantime, he came with a suitcase full of money, which they used to gamble. The interesting thing about the game is that Steve Sandler played with only one hand, his weak hand, his left hand. The score, 21-4, Sandler won. And here are some of the folks who visited Avenue P every weekend, hoisting Stevie on their shoulders after he defeated the great Jim Jacobs. And by the way, Stevie and Jimmy became very good friends after that. They actually partnered in a handball tournament, I believe, in 1967. This was a great upset. I mentioned Mark Levine before. In this photo, he's 18 years old. You see him raising his arms in victory because he just upset Steve Sandler. Sandler came down that day and asked if they would postpone the final match until the next week because he was injured. But of course, that really is a ridiculous request. And tournament management did not allow it. So Stevie is walking to your right dejectedly off the court. They played the next year in a rematch. They made the finals. And Stevie edged Mark 21-18 in the third game. This is 1972. Again, the venue is Brighton Beach Baths. Again, you can see in the background how crowded it is there. I wrote that there are 2,500 people. They may have been actually as many as 3,000 people. Sandler is serving to Ruby Obert, who is receiving. Ruby was the youngest of the three Obert brothers, and surely a great handball player in his own right. This is the same match against Ruby Obert, and Stevie is swinging his famous left hand, what I always considered the greatest defensive opposite hand. An opposite hand is that hand that is weaker than the strong hand. Stevie was right-handed, so his left hand is the opposite hand. And yes, we've had certain players who you can't really determine which is their weak hand. They seem to swing so well with either one. Now, this is a very interesting player because he had a severe limp from an injury that he sustained when he was a child. He's a wonderful athlete, and he became a great doubles player. Almost anybody who played handball with Artie Raya became a doubles champion. He had great hands, great anticipation. It was very, very hard to hit a ball past him. I remember playing against him, and whoever he played with, that's the person we hit to because it was just useless to try to hit the ball past Artie. And he wasn't a bad singles player either, by the way, oftentimes making the quarterfinals and one time actually making it all the way to the finals with that severe limp. And who did he lose to? Steve Sandler, of course.
Dan, I just want to, if you could just sort of hurry.
Move a little more swiftly?
Yeah, please.
Will do. Okay, 1981, Stevie Sandler winning his last singles championship against Danny Maroney. Anna Calderon's second great women's player of the 1980s. Jack Harris, self-proclaimed oldest player at 89. And if you notice, there's a crowd watching him play. Al Torres, probably the most durable player ever. He was still playing against men 20 years his junior in his 70s. Joe D'Urso, the greatest singles player of the 1980s and self-proclaimed greatest player of all time. I have my doubts about that. Mark Goldberg, a very fine player. The reason I selected the picture is because of his diving on the floor. This was not only his method of playing, it was the method of many other players as well. Morris Levitsky, I said, the greatest referee. In 1991, they had a Morris Levitsky Day for him. Notice the T-shirts with a photograph of him. A giant in handball. And if he looks like a giant, it's because he is a giant. 6'5", 280 pounds, a great handball player, and a giant contributor to our game, Paul Williams. Another great women handball player. Note the slenderness of her body and the smoothness of her swing, Tracy Davis. That is myself when I got the Carl Porter Award in 2009. Rookie Wright is probably the greatest player with the racquetball as a handball player, a ball which will most likely replace the small hard handball, which we have all been familiar with. Cesar Sala and Satish Jagnandan, the best two players of the early part of this century. Married couple, Albert Apuzzi, Hall of Fame player, great one-waller, and his wife, Dory Tan, who you will hear from soon. Also a great player with 14 national championships. Here are the three Obert brothers who graced us at Coney Island with their presence in 2016. Ruby, Oscar, and Carl. Two super doubles masters players. Note the difference in their sizes. Dennis Uffer, 250 pounds, and Joe Augusto, maybe 125 pounds soaking wet. Our best player of the day, Tyree Bastidas. You would not be able to know whether he was left-handed or right-handed. He's a wonderful handball player. And lastly, myself in my last game in the Super Masters, I was 72 at the time, and we did win thanks to my partner. And that gave me my 10th National Masters player and elevated me to Grandmaster. And okay.
All right.
Okay.
Dan, thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. And you gave a nice overview, a panoramic view of Coney Island handball history and one wall history. I should mention something that just I received a message. In the audience is a former student of mine from a Brooklyn high school, from when I taught high school. And she texted me during your talk, Dan, that it seems that you taught her husband when he was at, I guess, Abraham Lincoln. So here we are. I knew there would be several connections. Here's another one. So you taught the husband, I taught the wife in high school. I understand you had all three of those sons in his family. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Williams, who we saw a great picture of with Dan's presentation. And Paul is a businessman, but he's also a very important figure in the development of handball, and especially he's the founder of the Inner City Handball Association, of which I'm privileged to be a member of the board. And Paul is going to present now. So he'll give us some history of the founding, as well as some of the goals of his organization. So Paul, and thank you again, Dan.
That was a good presentation, Dan. A lot of history there. A lot of history. Some of it I was part of. Are you able to see the screen, Rich? Is my screen sharing?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. So, you know, I've been playing handball for pretty much about 50 years. You know, I'm 62 years old, and I've loved the game since I was 10 years old. unlike a lot of the handball players that I grew up with, most of them, their fathers were handball players. So somebody in their family were handball players, but most of the time it was their fathers. And their sons grew up to be great handball players. My father, he didn't play handball at all. He didn't even really know what it was because he was, a career Navy veteran who served 3 different wars, World War II, Vietnam, Korean War. So, handball was something he didn't really think about or know about. My mother was a high school secretary for about 35 years, and she knew about the game. Actually, she was elementary school secretary, and she knew about the game, but never really had much involvement with it. Luckily, I had a brother that did play, Joseph Williams, who was a really good handball player, and I wanted to be like him. But growing up in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, opportunities for playing, you had local handball courts all over the place, but you never really got to play, some of the top players that you would hear about. And, pretty much at 12, 13 years old, you didn't really hear a lot about handball players in general, other than was in your local area. Since I was in Bed-Stuy, maybe I'll go to Bushwick, Crown Heights, and that was as far as I would go really until like the age of 15. And mainly because, I tried venturing to Coney Island a couple times, and the reception, not necessarily at the courts, but even getting to the courts, as a young Black teen trying to get to Coney Island riding a bike, once you got past Avenue U, it's a whole different ball game. You got stopped by some local gangs, you got stopped by the police, you got stopped by everybody wanting to know what you were doing there and where were you going, because there weren't that many African Americans going through that neighborhood. And then, sometimes I even once I got to a little close to Coney Island, had the police stop and give me a little escort to see exactly where I was going. Because when I tell them I'm playing handball, they were like, really? Yeah, okay. Because there wasn't a lot of African American players playing on Coney Island at that time. There were a few that played in my neighborhood that ventured to Coney Island, like, George Hoggart, who's a fireman. You had Danny DeLoach, but it was really a handful of players. I never got to meet the great Winfield Balance. I wish I did, because, he was welcomed by everyone. But it was a different environment in those days. If you notice with Dan's pictures, there wasn't a lot of diversity in the crowd. And that's, like, if you see the picture that I have, later on, this picture was in 1990, what was it, 1991. And, it was a little bit diverse even in the audience. But I always, when I started in the City Handball Association, thought of the idea of making it a more diverse group. Because even when I was age 16, I was sponsored by Eugene Woods, who was pretty much one of the only African-American players at Union Temple, Brooklyn Union Temple. And he made sure that he saw me playing on the courts, and he said, you know what, you need to experience a little bit more than just the street handball. You need to get involved with, some club handball, meet some really good players that have been playing for years. He said some of us that were playing in Harlem and some of the other boroughs, we wasn't really invited to some of the tournaments. And I didn't know how much of that was true. As a 15-year-old kid, you're just like, okay, well, this guy wants to sponsor you to a club, you take advantage of it and say, okay, let me try it out and see what happens. And with that, though, I was able to meet a totally different world of handball players, like Dan Flixstein said. Many of them are lawyers, doctors, teachers, educators, entrepreneurs, professional people who basically ended up mentoring me and, making sure that, although I became a better player, to make sure I focused on school and getting a good job. And that's sort of the thing that, I wanted to make sure I brought to the table to other young people, because, you have the street ball, but there is a whole world of handball besides the street ball. You have four-wall handball, you have international handball. A lot of times now you'll hear the word wall ball, which is, handball played with a racquetball. But it's all, to me, handball, because I grew up when it was all called handball. I ended up going from street ball to playing in the YMCA. I've been a member of the YMCA since 1976. One of the reasons for that was that, growing up in Brooklyn with the, I was on the Brooklyn handball team for Brooklyn Tech. I was the on the second doubles at that time. We were undefeated for the whole year in 1975. Then they had budget cuts and they cut out the handball teams. So I felt like I was deprived of my teen youth of being able to compete in high school handball. And then, as you know, I didn't realize, like Dan was saying in his history, that, you know, in 1976, the AAU has stopped running, ran its last tournament. And during that time in 75 and 76, I would hear, people, I wanted more junior tournaments. And they said, well, we're not going to be, tournaments are not going to be run the same way anymore. And, because there's too many undesirables getting into the sport. And I took offense to that a little bit because I was like, wait a minute, I'm considered one of those undesirables. And, but because I was a member of a four-wall club, I was able to meet a lot of other players that didn't look at me that way. At least not initially, or maybe initially, but then after they got to know me, things changed. I felt that young people, no matter what nationality, was giving a button rap whenever they got to the court. Because if you didn't know anybody, no one else would really play you. If you went to a court where the top players were, you got shoved onto the back and no one really, would allow you to play, even if you called next, because usually there's a whole slew of old people that's calling next, even though they're not playing. They would just call next so they could see the good games that they wanted to see. And so if you were a young player, all you could do is maybe watch, but you couldn't get on that court. So as I got older, this particular picture here, which was in 1991, which basically helped start Inner City Handball Association. Because what happened, a photographer, Holly Koffler, actually caught a shot of the match where we were playing. This was a tiebreaker where we lost 11-10 tiebreaker. It was my first, my second open championship match. I was in the finals with Al Torres as my partner playing against the Lonigan brothers. And during that tiebreaker towards the end, I dove for the shot and, it was on cement. And I believe I made the shot, but we still lost the match 11-1, so it didn't really matter. But the whole idea was that the kids that were watching that match, they saw, there was a lot of kids and they were like, hey, man, we want to play handball like you. This actually shot ended up on the cover of Handball magazine and used for the 1991 three-wall national shot also, even though it wasn't three-wall. So it got a lot of notoriety, gave me a lot of notoriety, and a lot of local kids started contacting me about, how, if I can coach them. And so that's when Inner City Handball started. Those kids, with some of them like Kendall Lewis, Jaira Gu, Joe Kaplan, late Jason Morgan, and a few other kids were like, we want to play more handball. So I started the group and didn't do it really officially until like 1992. But we actually started in 1991, and I was able to use my own money, my own funds. I was a computer consultant and made pretty good money. And I was able to sponsor a number of kids to get involved with some smaller tournaments where first tournaments was only like 26 kids would enter, even less than that sometimes. But now we're up to like 150 plus whenever we have a junior tournament. And then the kids have an opportunity to be able to, our goal was to make sure they finished high school at that time. And by making sure they finished high school, they can try and have a better life and go to college. So with Inner City Handball, we're a 501c3 charity. We've been around, like I said, since 1991. So we're 30 years old. We've been able to get sponsors to be able to make sure that kids are allowed to join the YMCAs, join private clubs, get travel subsidies to travel to national tournaments and international tournaments, and also be able to have book scholarship funds, which, we hope to increase the money. Give out $1,000 scholarships every year. Last year was like 3,000. This year we hope to get to 6,000 to 10,000. But we want to keep increasing it to make sure that these young athletes have an opportunity to benefit from the sport and also be able to secure their education, because that's the most important thing. We want to be good citizens, good players, but make sure they have an education, make sure they get a good job, and hopefully they'll come back and help serve as mentors to other young people. So we have a nice awards dinner every year and our foundation fundraiser that culminates in November every year. In fact, this year we have the ICHA dinner, is going to be on November 17th, which will be posted on our website at icha.org, which is most of the information about our tournaments, and the kids are on that site. And we have a ICHAlive.tv site, which actually has videos of top players, top junior players, players who started out as young teens. In fact, we had players that started out as young teens, in a picture like this, like we have Taiwan Cook, who's like one of the #1 players, Tyree Bastides, which Dan Flickstein mentioned. All of them have become great adult players. And through the history of ICHA, where we have our Perfect Game newsletter, we've been able to have articles that we spread out and share information about the sport and how people could get more involved in the sport. As I talked about diversity, you saw Dan's pictures. He's now, instead of using white, colors have changed. People are using more colors on the court, but also there's more colorful people. And one of the things that ICHA have been proud to be able to introduce a lot of players of colors into local organized championships, as well as national championships, as well as international championships. And that's something that didn't really happen until pretty much like 1993, when we took our first team to Bray Island to do an invitational to the World Handball Council to make sure that One World Handball got included into the World Championships that happened every 3 years. That used to be only 4 World Championships. So we're pretty proud of that accomplishments. This is a picture from 2015. It was in Calgary, Canada. At that time we had 9 travel teams that occurred over a period of 21 years. And we had champions that got gold, silver, and bronze, young players of all nationalities and diversity. I was the first African-American officer for the World Handball Council, as well as the USHA. I was vice president, then became president of the World Handball Council. And then after that, there was actually, we were able to get a woman to be president of the Worlds, and at least this is becoming a more diverse group. And lastly, one of our major goals, we try to accomplish quite a few things, but one of the things I'm hopeful to do is try and get a multi-sport arena that's set up for 1 wall and 4 wall, and maybe even having 3 wall on the outdoors, so we can have a championship event in New York that can actually host a triathlon of the sport, and also have an indoor venue. So this way we can have really good world championship play. Right now we have good outdoor facilities, but if weather is inclement, the weather is bad, international players can't afford to stay in New York long enough to be able to compete until the weather, subsides. So to help elevate the sport even more, I'm working with some of the local politicians in New York. Hopefully we can get an armory converted, part of one of the Brooklyn armories, to be able to have a facility similar to this. But, it's a dream, lifetime goal. If we can make it happen and serve thousands of young people through the sport of handball. That's basically what Inner City Handball Association does. We educate, mentor, and serve young people through the sport of handball. And even though people said it was, handball was a sport that was dying in 1974 when I was still playing, I'm here to make sure with some of my other board members that, we make sure that handball stays around for another 30 years. And that's all I have to say about it, unless you have any questions.
Well, the questions, Paul, will take the questions at the end.
Yep.
And thank you very much for that presentation. I just want to point out that standing next to you is one of the ICHA board members, Jared Vale, who is actually in the audience today. So a shout out to Jared, another member of the ICHA board. And Paul, you have done great work with this. You are an inspiration. And it is great to see this happening. That facility sounds fantastic. Let us hope that you see it to fruition. And we hope it's going to be in Brooklyn.
Yes.
So, and now it is, thank you very much, Paul. And it is now my pleasure to introduce to you a a champion women's handball player, Dory 10. But what makes this doubly pleasurable for me is that Dory is a graduate of New York City College of Technology. Actually, when she graduated, it was our school was called the New York City Technical College, but now it is New York City College of Technology, and that's where the BWRC is housed. And so, welcome to an alum. And Dory has a interesting thing that Dan alluded to before, because her husband is a great handball player as well. So Dory, thank you so much for coming and coming back to your college.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Hard shoes to fill after Danny spoke and Paul, the creator and founder of Inner City Handball. So much of what I have to say is either repeated through what Paul experienced, since we're pretty much the same age. So if I sound redundant, please forgive me. So born in Queens, but raised in Brooklyn, the waterfront. So I lived in all neighborhoods of the southern waterfront. So that includes Manhattan Beach, Brighton Beach, Coney Island, and Seagate. I covered all the sand there. But my formative years were in Brighton Beach. And it was a great place to live because I lived across the street from a schoolyard, PS 253, and I lived 2 blocks from the ocean. And I lived pretty much around the corner from Brighton Beach Baths. So my upbringing was just full of outdoor activity. I had an older sister who was the tomboy of Brighton Beach, and every kid knocked on the door to find out where my sister was, because my sister had a ball, who had a stick, a stick ball, boxing gloves, you name it. So I really looked up to my sister, and my sister did play handball in the back of Grady High School Park there. And since she was so popular, I wanted to be just like my sister in being popular. Being 5 years younger than she, I just could not hang out with her because she was just too good and I was too weak. But I have to say, one day, my sister brought home a wooden paddle. And I am the third of 5 children, so there was not a lot of money in the house. So sporting equipment was not found in the house. But you had a ball, perhaps a jump rope. You went to the schoolyard and someone else had some other athletic equipment that you use. So when all the adults were finished playing in the back of PS 253 handball courts, I was able to try and hit this paddle. It was a wooden paddle. It weighed probably half of what my weight was at the time. But you just start to develop a swinging thing. The reason why a lot of the adults liked me around was I was so thin that if the ball went over the fence, they would have to scale the fence, and all I had to do was stick my scrawny, bony hands through the hurricane fence, and I was able to get their ball. So they liked me staying around when their ball went over, and they allowed me to play paddle ball there. Well, over the years, eventually, we moved to Coney Island. I played in the back of PS 90. It was just a very, very small group of people. But one day we all said, you know what, let's go to the big boy courts. And that was West 5th Street. And that was the mecca of handball. And although I didn't play handball, it was certainly a mecca of people playing paddleball. And so at the age of 15, just like Paul, I decided to go to West 5th Street and start playing paddleball there. And you got a great education there, because not only did you have great players who played paddleball, but you also got to see how handball was played. And this was going back in the 70s. So You had these old timers there, and it was just a wonderful place to be. There was beautiful grass that you could sit out on the lawn, and families were there. You could go swimming, come back. These courts were so crowded that you had to have pen and paper, and you had to sign your name so that you could be 5th or 6th on the list. You could go to Nathan's, eat, come back and still play, go to swim, dry off, and you'd still have 3 more people before you could get to play paddleball. How I got introduced to handball was Albert Apuzzi. So in 1987, we were introduced. I kind of knew about him because I knew about Joe and Albert through playing paddleball. If someone said, who is Albert? I could sort of point over there and say, it's those guys over there. But he was instrumental in getting me to get a job at the local hospital. I was working at the time, Sloan Kettering and New York Hospital, as a laboratory technician. Thanks to New York City Technical College, I got a great education there. And just as a shout out, I have to say there were 2 great professors there. That was Dr. Alan Kay, a phenomenal English teacher who really opened my eyes to literature and what is out there. And I really have to give kudos to him and just a shout out to him. And the other one was someone very, very dear to my heart, and that was Professor Cy Zaglin, who was just a chocolate bonbon. He was delicious, if I could use that word to describe someone. He was just a wonderful, kind-hearted, always encouraging me to pursue my academics even more and more. He insisted that I become a physician, and I insisted not, that I prefer to have a life. Not to say that physicians don't have a life, but I really wanted to become a physician assistant, and I did. But getting back, so Albert was instrumental in getting me to Coney Island Hospital, and he was able to secure a job in chemistry, and I would be working 4 to 12 a.m., which meant I had the whole day to myself. I live now in Seagate, so I could play all day and then work at night. And I worked Sunday through Thursday, which means I had Friday and Saturday off. This was such a dream for me, and I became good friends with Albert. And he was so nice and such a gentleman. And he one day said, why don't you play handball? And I said, I can't, I'm scared. And he said, listen, you're a lefty and you're tall. You've got something working here, and perhaps I can help you with this. And so I hit the ball once, and I thought my hand was going to fall off. I just could not imagine what these men, and I had a greater appreciation for handball, I could not imagine. So he put on another glove and another glove. By the time he was finished, I looked like the Michelin woman, because I even had 2 pairs of gloves. I had a winter glove on. This is now, I think, April that I decided to hit this ball. And I just thought that my fingers were going to crack like glass. But he pursued, and he kept after me saying, please try it. And over time, I kind of understood how to hit the ball, that you can hit the ball flat. You had to curve your hand almost like a cesta highlight. And over time, the learning curve is much longer than clearly paddleball or racquetball, that he made me a champion. And I have to thank him tremendously for putting up with me and crying about how painful this was. But in the end, I am grateful. I started, I think, in 1991 when I entered my first nationals. I lost to the great Rosemary Bellini. It was a tiebreaker. I lost 11-10. And I have to say that your greatest lessons in life are sometimes your failures. And I look back and I try to figure out, how do I win against this great female athlete who was phenomenal, who had then left one wall and went to 4-wall. So she was great in 1-wall, 3-wall, and 4-wall, Rosemary Bellini. next year, I was determined. I ran the boardwalk. I did everything I could possibly do to win. And so I won in 1992, my first national championship against Bellini again in a tiebreaker. Only this time I won 11-10. So it was a wonderful experience. And that was the beginning of really learning the craft of handball. And that year I met my partner in handball, Barbara Kenton Jackson, and we decided we were going to be two tall women. They used to call us the Twin Towers. They also called us Ebony and Ivory, she being a Black woman. And we won 5 national championships. I've won 2 singles, and she's also won 2 singles. So in being best friends, we have the same amount of singles and in doubles. She's just been a phenomenal help, and so have I in her game. We enjoy the game. I'd love to see the game move and see more people playing small ball. Unfortunately, at my age now, I had to give up handball simply because of running on concrete. My ankles are really not meant to be running. So I have gone back to playing paddleball, which I'm pretty successful at. But unfortunately, my heart is still a handball player, and it will always be. Even though I started in handball and I will end in handball, perhaps maybe pickleball. As we get older and joints become more and more stiff, I think you get to play games that sadly are not as strenuous as handball. Handball is just really an incredible game of lunging and jumping and twisting that you can't find in any other sport that is so enjoyable outside. I do want to mention just a funny thing in the education of handball is that when we were kids, I don't know if anyone else in this panel, if the ball hit a rock or if something went wrong with that ball, I don't know if any of the panelists also used to say, oh, that was a Hindu. Does anyone remember a Hindu? And it's only when I went to West Fifth Street did I realize that we were all saying the wrong word, Hindu, and it was hinder. And we learned the vocabulary word of hinder. And I guess people who didn't know what the word hinder was used to say Hindu. And so I grew up learning that when the ball hit something or hit the line and popped up and you couldn't get the ball, it was a Hindu. Or if you jumped in front of the wall, in front of the ball, it was a Hindu. So I'm just remembering that fun memory of growing up and enjoying as a child handball.
Dory, thank you very much for sharing all of that with us. And I think, you know, it's funny, one learned how one was becoming a sophisticate when one started calling those shots hinders rather than Hindus.
Yes.
The people I play with, they're still Hindus out in Queens. So yes, but that is certain. But if you go on to a more sophisticated court, you'll use the word hinder. Yes, indeed. And I also sympathize, although then on the other side, beginning the game and putting on multiple pairs of gloves, as my old arthritic hands have gotten worse and worse. At this end of the game, I have several pairs of gloves on when I play now. So yes, but thank you so much. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Jai Raghu, who is a handball player. He's a champion. I understand will be traveling out west next week to national four-wall championships. So handball playing can get you around. And as Paul mentioned, he's had his inner city handball kids to to Canada, to Ireland, and elsewhere. And Jai was he was in the first cohort of Paul's inner city handball team. So I will let Jai speak to you. He's a computer he works in the field of technology now. He's a graduate of both Brooklyn Technical School and Lake Forest College, which has a rather well-known handball, although four-wall, but has a four-wall handball program. So Jai, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Yeah, and Dory, as a Hindu, I do remember when people used to say Hindu and would look at them instead of understanding what they were talking until I learned the proper term. So yeah, thank you for bringing back those fond memories. I'm also going to echo a lot of what Dan, Paul, and Dory were talking about, because in many ways I've benefited from this rich history that Dan spoke about, as well as faces some of the challenges that Paul mentioned. As well as meeting lifelong friends like Dory mentioned. Most significantly, I benefited from ICHA and met great, wonderful human beings such as Dory, Jared Vale, Paul Williams, and other members of this panel, just to name a small few. So I grew up in the 80s in the Bronx, where every park had a basketball court. Next to the basketball court is a handball court. Although at that time I didn't play handball or basketball for that matter, because again, it was the Bronx and the 80s. So the parks were not a safe place to be. It wasn't until I started high school in the early 90s when I saw some people hitting a ball against the wall in the parking lot of Brooklyn Tech that I was actually introduced to the sport. Those individuals became lifelong friends. To this day, when we get together, it's usually at a handball court where we are playing or spectating. As also in the early 90s, as Paul mentioned, the Inner City Handball Association came onto the scene. I remember one of the first tournaments they threw at the handball courts in Yankee Stadium, and I was there, and this introduced me to the tournament competitive aspect of the game. So my friends and I wanted to become good enough to be able to join the Brooklyn Tech handball team. And to get better, we realized that we have to adopt this tournament competitive aspect of the game rather than the casual neighborhood style park playing like we were doing in the parking lot. So we travel to more different parks in New York City to see what good players look like and how they play the game. Although we traveled to Coney Island, Grand Street in Chinatown, and West 4th in the Village, I live in the Bronx, so Bailey Park became my main training ground at this point. ICHA also started a program to introduce us kids to a four-wall handball at the 63rd Street YMCA, which was awesome and eye-opening in many ways. With one wall, as Dan mentioned, you need a ball and a single wall. Like a wall in a parking lot was fine. You paint the lines on the ground, or as Dan mentioned, you just use chalk and draw the lines yourself. If you have three friends and each of you put together a quarter, then you could be able to buy a handball at the local bodega for $1. And that's all the equipment you need. If there's snow on the ground, you just shovel it. If it rained last night, you just take newspaper and dry up the courts. Whereas with four wall, you have, well, four walls. So it's a room with the dimensions of 40 feet by 20 feet, from my experience, it's essentially a room with enough square footage for an entire family to comfortably live in. So suffice to say, with four wall, you needed a gym membership. With membership, you get the luxury of climate control environment to play handball year round with no worries of the cold, snow, rain, or heat waves. Also eye-opening is that the point four wall was more widely played nationally and internationally. So being able to play four-wall enabled me to view a wider world beyond the four boroughs. Yeah, we didn't go to Staten Island, so I have no idea what that scene looked like. So I'm going to say the four boroughs. After graduating high school, I matriculated and played four-wall handball at Lake Forest College, which is located in the northern suburb of Chicago, which is, suffice to say, a huge change of scenery compared to living in the Bronx in the late 80s during certain epidemics. Also in 1993, as Paul mentioned, ICH took a bunch of us kids to the World Handball Tournament in Ireland, where we became the ambassadors of one wall variation of sport that we play in New York City. And we introduced it to the wider international handball community. I'm not saying that one thing led to another, but internationally, currently, one wall handball that we play on the streets of New York is the fastest growing compared to the other variations of four wall and three wall. To round off my handball story, I stopped playing for a few years. I got married and we got a daughter who is now 9. Then after a few years of home life, I realized that I was getting unhealthy. I wasn't doing anything physically. And so I was in overall bad shape. So I decided to come back to handball. Very quickly, all the things that I did when I was a teenager, I ended up doing. I started to play in my neighborhood park. Once I got stronger, I started playing in the parks with better players. I now play at Coney Island most Saturday and Sunday mornings. Then I started to enter tournaments again. Because for me, when you enter a tournament, you're setting a goal, which is essentially not to embarrass yourself and losing first round. So it forced me to train and practice for that goal. And yes, when I enter a tournament, those same high school friends are now not far away cheering me on and sharing in my wins and defeats. So that's it. Thank you for this opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Jai. That was very precise and inspiring. And now I will open for questions from the audience that they might have that I am. So if there are any questions, please, you can type them into the Q&A at the bottom of the page. In the meanwhile, what I will ask is, Paul, what have been some of the countries to which you have taken members of ICHA?
Oh, we went to our first international trip was Wales, which was about 1990. No, actually, the first international trip was it Wales? Yeah, it was Wales. And then afterwards, we went to Bray Island. We went to Ireland, Wales, Italy, England, Ireland a few times.
How was it paid for?
Basically, in the early years, it was paid by me the first 5 years. And then after that, we started getting donations. So over the years, we've been getting donations from grassroots handball players, primarily a lot of football players. Jim Jacobs Foundation has been a great contributor to us. As Dan Flixing mentioned, Jim Jacobs played at Coney Island Avenue P one wall with Stevie Sandler. I had the opportunity of meeting Jim Jacobs when I was about 18. And I guess during that time, I made a little bit of impression on him and his wife. And then after he passed, I met his widow years later, and she became a major donor to our organization. So between them and the New York Athletic Club, the Berkowitz II Foundation, and then our board members, which Jai is one of the board members, as well as yourself, you help raise funds to help us support the youth programs.
Okay, and you also membership into clubs so that the young members can learn to play four wall?
Yeah, we basically make sure that every year I'm on the board of the Jamaica Y. And so through the Y, we're able to offer scholarships to, at least 40 to 60 young players that are interested in playing four wall. And this way it's a citywide membership, which is very different than other scholarships that people give to one particular Y. These teams can play in any Y throughout the 5 boroughs. This way, and we did that because, players, young people want to be with their friends. And if their friends, are only in one particular place, and they have a membership in Manhattan and they live in Brooklyn, they're not going to associate with their friends. By offering these scholarships, they can get involved with the programs of the Y, get involved with playing handball in a safe environment, learning the sport of four wall. And some Ys, they also have one wall courts, like Chinatown Y, McBurney Y, Coney Island Y, Jamaica Y, they all have one wall courts, even Five Towns Y. So this way they could play one wall and four wall and just experience a safe environment with their friends.
Okay, there's one question out that's been reached out to you. How do you think social media and corporate endorsements can best be used to achieve the dream of an indoor stadium? By the way, where would you like to see that stadium located?
Basically, we were talking to Assemblywoman Zinnerman, who has she covers the district of Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. So the Marcus Garvey Armory that's in Brooklyn and Bed-Stuy is up for basically renovation and conversion to athletic facility. All the other conversions of armories throughout the city have not included handball courts. And so I'm hoping that, social media could definitely go to, there's a website that we have. I don't have the exact website, but I'll make sure I give it to you and we'll post it on our website for this Marcus Garvey project that's in Bed-Stuy and the conversion. And so we sent out a link before. More people that would entertain the idea of having an indoor facility or welcome the idea of having it would be a big help, because the city doesn't realize that handball is a sport that it is. They think of it as just a game that's played with local players. They don't know the extent and the magnitude of the sport and how it affects, thousands of young people and thousands of old people. And so the more companies know, corporate endorsements will be a big plus. Corporate endorsements to even our sport. We run a number of tournaments throughout the year for juniors. And if we can get corporate sponsors to help in supporting the tournaments and helping support our scholarship funds that we have for these young people, goes a long way. We want to show that the sport, even though I know the press likes to highlight the, drugs and drinking that's in the, worst neighborhoods of the city, unfortunately, they don't try to promote or highlight what's going on with the good players and the good groups of players that are involved with the sport. And, even though we've been on television a number of times over the years, recently, all I see is articles about handball dying out still again, 50 years later. And they only focus on the old players in Florida that were relocated New Yorkers that are playing in Florida as the surviving members of the handball culture. And I'm like, how could a New York paper focus on New York, on Florida players and not focus?
Right, they could have come to Queens. We have some old-time players in Queens or Brooklyn, certainly, but
But they go to Florida. I don't understand it, but that's what we need.
Just as an aside, Paul, you might remember that, or there are no 3-wall handball courts in New York, as far as I know. Is that correct?
That's right. They just highlight courts at certain parks like Lincoln Terrace Park. It used to be at Central Park. They took that down. I think there's one in Staten Island and also Forest Hills, but those are highlight type courts that were used for training for 4-wall players in the summer.
Right. So at any rate, when they were designing Brooklyn Bridge Park, which beautiful park along, underneath Brooklyn Heights, as some of you might know,
Yeah, I've been there.
largest park development forever. It's a big, big success. You might remember, Paul, you and I spoke about the possibility of having the handball courts that they were going to construct at Brooklyn Bridge Park. Wouldn't it be great, since they were designing, since it's new, to make them 3-wall courts? And at that time, the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center was having one of the speakers, as one of our speakers, the architect from that. And when I broached that particular suggestion to him, he said, "What, are you crazy? You're gonna have like rooms in that park? Who knows what'll be going on there? Handball players, you don't know what they'll be doing. We can't have that." So there were 1-wall courts designed. Well, they're nice courts. And one more thing about those, smack in the middle of each court, there was a drainage hole. So
Yes.
smack in the middle of each of those courts, it was a hole. I think they finally plugged them up, but balls would get stuck. It wasn't.
Yeah.
So you knew that the people who were designing this had no idea about the game at all. And you see that in so many cases. And you're right about not many people knowing about handball, and it needs more publicity and better publicity. So now, Dan, did you see, you were a coach for years at Abraham Lincoln High School, correct? A handball coach?
Yes.
So you were there when they cut funding for handball, the city cut funding for handball coaches, and
No, I was there when they replenished money.
oh, when they came back. Okay.
Yeah,
all
I
right.
coached well after Paul's time in high school. I coached starting, I believe, the late 80s until I retired in 96.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that helped, of course, kill the game. It always struck me that handball was such an inexpensive sport to continue, and they would have football, which cost thousands and thousands of dollars and served fewer people, but they cut handball, I guess, to say they were saving something. So, all right, we are almost out of time, but do we have here's a question to Dory, perhaps. I think 1-wall has a better appeal and a lesser learning curve than 4 or 3-wall handball. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, personally, I can say if you start off at 1-wall and try to play 4-wall, it was almost impossible, because your goal is to get that ball on the wall within 1 bounce, and you have to change your mentality that if the ball passes you in 4-wall, you can turn around and wait for the ball to hit off the back wall and return it. I had a dear friend who used to make jokes about 4-wall and saying that 4-wall was invented as a practical joke to a 1-waller. You could create your own hurricane spinning around trying to run after the ball. And I did find 4-wall very hard. I thought it was easier to play because you could punch the ball and it could bounce off every single wall and the back wall, and you're not really out. Whereas in 1-wall, the name of the game is controlling that ball between those yellow lines, or the lines. And so 1-wall is harder in that you have to control the ball, and 4-wall was harder to learn the side walls and the 4-walls. To me, when I first started playing 4-wall indoors, I felt like I was like in a bumper, playing pool. And you were bouncing, like you kept following the walls and the ball, and eventually you realized if it's going to hit a side wall, it's going to eventually come to the center. So you had to be very patient in playing 4-wall. Whereas in one wall, you have to just attack the ball and get to it before it bounces its second bounce. So for me, the learning curve definitely was harder for four wall, less with three wall. I enjoyed three wall many years of going to Toledo, Ohio to play in their tournaments. It was a wonderful tournament, but four wall was much harder if you're starting out playing one wall. And I can say the reverse, that people who play four wall found it very difficult, because when the four wall women would come and try and play ball, my strategy was to hit the ball high so that they would turn around and hit the ball in one wall and realize there's no back wall. And I would gain 3 or 4 points just on serving a high ball to the back of a one wall court for a four wall to be confused by that. So I thought it was harder to learn four wall.
Okay,
The other panelists may think otherwise.
thank you. I have a question, not a question. There's someone wrote a statement here. In the advertisements we sent out, we used a quote from some historical, an old thing that handball was tennis for savages. And this person eloquently says that it should be, we rephrased, it's tennis for the people. Tennis is inaccessible but is inaccessible. Handball is for every New Yorker.
May I respond to it?
Sure.
Right. First, I agree with Dory about what she said about four wall. Yeah, 100%. But regarding tennis for savages, I think that that phrase was written not to reflect the people who play the game, although I'm sure that there are some people who play handball who are uncivilized, but there are uncivilized people in all sports, and the hockey players who beat each other up with sticks. But tennis for savages is all about the game. We play in the winter when it's freezing outside. We play in the summer when people are going to have heat strokes in 95 to 100 degree weather. We play with a light glove, which really offers almost no protection whatsoever for the hand. Really what it does is offer protection for the ball, so we don't get perspiration on it. The ball, although it's not as hard as a golf ball, it's probably the next best thing to a golf ball in terms of its hardness. So that's why it's tennis for savages. It's not because of the people who play. It's because of the difficulty of the game.
Okay, and I'm going to offer any of you any last words before we close up and say goodbye in this great session that we had today. So do anyone want to make a final closing comment or statement?
Oh, Rich, I just want to thank you for having this this forum, just to allow us to tell a little bit about the history and our experiences with handball. And hopefully we'll get some people that will look at handball in a different light and choose to support.
Okay, I'm certainly welcome. I mean, this has been such a kick for me to do this, because I love to play handball, and it just lets my other aspect of the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center to be used for that. And I remember the day that I was sitting around with my staff and we were talking about possible things, and someone mentioned handball and Coney Island. Of course, how come I've been doing these breakfast talks for 10 years and never thought before this to have an event on handball? And our previous event was our annual conference, which I mentioned before was slightly gloom and doomish. We talked about sea level rise and climate change and the implications for the Brooklyn waterfront of all those changes. So this was a much more upbeat closing to the academic year. So anyone else?
It's just such a pleasure for me to share the platform with Paul and with Dory. I'm so glad to see her again. And a reconnection with Jai, who was an amazing gentleman when he was 17, and what a fine man he's become. And to meet you, Richard, it's a real pleasure.
Nice to meet you. Okay, so Dory, great seeing you again.
Same here, Dr. Hanley. Can't call you Richard. I must call you Dr. Hanley.
Okay, and
For inviting me.
we
And Paul
will,
and Jai, I'll see you Saturday at the handball courts.
Yeah. Oh,
and Jai, good luck to you next week at the Nationals.
thank you
Yeah,
very
good
much.
luck.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Okay, that's it, folks. And so
So long,
everyone,
everyone.
thank you
Bye-bye.
very much for coming, to all the attendees. We hope that you've enlightened and you want to go out and become handball missionaries. And don't forget to follow ICHA and maybe even donate, who knows? Okay, thank you and so long.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.